Ladies and gentlemen, this is the main event of the evening. And now, it's time!
Welcome to you who are at the most august of audiences this month of August. We've had a bit of an extended break, have we not? Due to some personal tensions. We all have to pay bills, and money is simply too tight to mention. So let's begin the show with a catch-up of some of the major events and goings-on, starting with this moron.
Terrorist Hamas is stealing UAE aid intended for civilians. Hamas, traffic the red.
Now I'm happy to be blocked by this guy and others of his ilk on X for my responding to them in the past, and you're about to see why. Because had it not been posted by someone claiming to be Sunni, Salafi, it wouldn't have bothered me. But because he and others like him associate themselves with our Athari school, the normative school of Sunni Islam, the damage they do to the reputation of the religion is of exponential harm. These are ghulat, extremists. And the Prophet ﷺ said about extremism in general, وَإِيَّاكُمْ وَالْغُلُوَ فِي الدِّينِ, and beware of going to extremes in religious matters. For those who came before you were destroyed on account of going to extremes in religion. From their ghulu, from their extremism, is their extreme hatred for their fellow Muslims. And you won't fail to notice that their hatred for Islamists is greater than it is for irreligious, ultra-liberal secularists. In fact, they hate all devout Muslims who do not share their disgusting Hizbiyya and cultish mentality. Their hatred is in fact a projection of a self-hatred that they suffer from. Firstly, why describe the resistance as
Terrorist Hamas?
Whose framing is this? The individual who posted this has the term Saudi in his handle, but even that kingdom at one point in time recognized the resistance as one of two legitimate authorities in Palestine. I'm talking here about the 2007 Mecca Agreement, in which Saudi's King Abdullah hosted a mediation between Fatah and Hamas towards a national unity government for Palestine.
The Palestinians are traveling again, this time to Mecca, Saudi Arabia. The goal? Cessation of violence and a national unity government.
سنعالج بإذن الله كل هذه الملفات على قاعدة الوحدة.
Our delegation, headed by Abbas, arrived first at the Saudi palace. Both Fatah and Hamas understood the importance of the summit when King Abdullah bin Aziz, one of the most important figures in the Islamic world, is their host. That doesn't allow them to hinder the talks, and thus everyone is making optimistic announcements.
So was the late King Abdullah fraternizing with, quote, terrorists? And even if KSA or any other Muslim country has since decided to prescribe the Palestinian resistance as a terrorist organization, not saying they have or haven't either way, but even if they do, that change doesn't have any Shari'i value, as it'd be a political designation, not a fiqhi one. The fiqh has not shifted, the political tide has. And if one says that Hummus are irhabis, irhabis meaning terrorists, because they are ikhwanis, and the ikhwanis have been designated irhabis by certain states, this too is a politically motivated designation which no serious scholar takes seriously. Bear in mind, the government of Turkey and Tunisia are ikhwani in their methodology and ideology, just as Egypt under Morsi was, or the ikhwani allied at the very least. Will you now call Turkey or Tunisia terrorist states? Is that the official position of the KSA? It certainly is not. So one rule for one authority over one part of the Ummah and another for another, it seems, with these ghulat. And the extremist, the Ghali, says,
Hamas is stealing UAE aid intended for civilians.
Let's reverse the roles for a bit, shall we? Imagine some Muslim country organizes shed loads of medicines, antiviral medicines and aspirin and condoms to an oil-rich Muslim country that is blighted by prostitution or by alcohol-fueled club culture. I will let your minds wander. Let's say the authorities of that country, in receipt of the aid, seize the contraception and Ketroprofen, saying, we'll take it from here, thank you very much, we'll handle the logistics in our own land, would you accuse that country, in receipt of the aid, of stealing from the donor country? Would you, ya ayyuhal ahmaq, ever dare accuse any oil-rich Gulf nation of misappropriating anything from anyone ever? Even though the Prophet ﷺ said, the Muslims are partners in three things: water, pasture, and fire. Meaning these natural resources, including fossil fuels, are public property unless found on privately owned land. And even as regards those resources found on private land, if the Muslim authority forcefully, violently seizes them, what did the Prophet ﷺ say? He said, hear and obey, in hardship and in ease, in pleasure and displeasure. And when someone is given preference over you, even if they consume your wealth and beat your back, unless there is clear disobedience to Allah. That hadith is talking about your wealth, your private wealth. You should still surrender it when the state attempts to usurp it. What then of aid, of zakah and sadaqah, which is designated for the society at large? How can a nation be accused of stealing what belongs to it? How can the resistance be accused of stealing food, fuel, and medicine that they are supposed to be managing and distributing? Even if they take a portion for themselves, for their own employees, this is in accordance with the Sharia of Allah. For did He, glorified and exalted be He, not reveal, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينَ, charity is only for the poor and for the needy, وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا, and for those employed to collect it. The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, there is no clear evidence whatsoever that the Palestinian resistance has been stealing aid. None. This is a smear from the accursed Yahud against the Muslims. And it's a smear which they only repeat in international media, and which these ghulat repeat on their behalf. Because among their own audience of Netanyahu's willing executioners, the Zionists admit that their IDF, their occupation forces, employ and arm the criminal gangs who loot and steal aid meant for Palestinian people, and that the resistance are at war with those criminal gangs.
A show of strength by a new militia in Gaza, challenging Hamas, apparently backed by Israel, and emerging from a murky past. Its leader, Yasser Abu Shabab, is an alleged former drug trafficker. Now he and up to 300 men are openly working with the new, much criticised aid distribution scheme backed by Israel and the US, helping, his media team say, load supplies and secure their entry to Gaza. But in the past, he's been accused of looting vast quantities of desperately needed aid. We've seen an internal UN document from late last year that describes Abu Shabab as a criminal, a gang leader, and a primary figure in the systematic looting of humanitarian aid. And it says his base is in an area controlled by the Israeli military. Now his men are escorting aid trucks entering Gaza from Kerem Shalom and heading to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites in southern Gaza. Last week, the Israeli Prime Minister appeared to confirm supporting figures like Abu Shabab in order to undermine Hamas.
On the advice of security officials, we activated clans in Gaza that oppose Hamas. What's wrong with this? It's only good and saves the lives of IDF soldiers.
What do you make of the fact that this man, Abu Shabab, alleged to have been a leading figure in the looting of aid, is now being given a role supposedly securing it?
Oh, there's a total irony that the one entity that we know and is on the record for having been involved in looting is now the entity that's been put in charge of managing the security around the looting. But look, this is part of a much bigger irony in that the entity, in this case the government of Israel, that's been responsible for blocking the supplies of aid coming into Gaza is now the entity that is supposed to be the one to guarantee that supply.
Israel has long sought to play Palestinian factions off against each other with bloody consequences. Another dark chapter now looks to be unfolding.
And if these are indeed the resistance you see mounted on these trucks, why is it unreasonable to assume that they're protecting the aid, securing it from those criminal Zionist proxies who are given to steal it? Really, what this traitor is saying, whether he knows it or not, is that he wants the Israelis to take charge of the aid because that's the default. If it's not the Palestinians who are managing and distributing the aid, then it's the criminal kuffar or their lackeys. Or does he like to see the fawda, the frenzy of the desperate and destitute ransacking resources in a battle of survival of the fittest, where those most vulnerable and in need of aid, the weak, the women and children, will be the least able to secure a sack of flour, nay, even a grain of rice for themselves?
It is the most cruel thing I have ever seen in my life, to deprive people of food in the way that has been done here, to shoot at them, to kill them, to injure them when they try to get food, and to have engineered a chaos that allows or that forces people now to fight each other and to find themselves in a sort of survival of the fittest reality.
And how is it that this idiot can smear the resistance as when their rank and file self-identify as Sunni? Yes, their political leadership have sought military material support from Iran, but this doesn't nullify Sunniness. If you are so special as to believe that a Sunni statesman making political overtures and gestures to a Shiite statesman for reasons of political expediency renders void the Sunniness of the entire society and his political class, then be consistent. Apply the same stupid standard across the board. Apply it to the Gulf statesmen who offered their condolences to the dead Iranian president, such as the UAE Crown Prince paying his respects to the Iranian embassy, as we see here. Cuss out as a Rafidi rat his father. I dare you. MBZ, the UAE president, who said, "We pray that God grants them, the dead Iranians, eternal rest, and we extend our heartfelt sympathies to their families." The UAE stands in solidarity with Iran at this difficult time. Call out the Shiism of the UAE Prime Minister and ruler of Dubai, who, according to the Arab News, wrote, and I quote, "Our condolences and sincere sympathies to the brotherly Iranian people and their leadership. Our hearts are with you in this difficult time. Our prayers are that God will cover them with his vast mercy and dwell them in his spacious paradise." Now, would I visit sovereign Iranian territory, as is an embassy, to pay my respects as the leader of the Emirates did? Would I offer my condolences as he did? No, I would not. But then I'm not the one burdened with the affairs of state like he is, am I? A politician has to consider the wider consequences and likely fallout were he to break from diplomatic norms as regards protocols of politeness following the national tragedies of their neighbors. But either way, whether you agree or disagree with how the rulers of the UAE express their sympathy with the Shia of Iran at the death of their leaders, if such acts don't make the Emirati emirs, quote, Rafidi rats, then it doesn't make the Palestinian emirs vermin either. The extremist then says,
why does the pro-Zionist Hamas media reject the airdrops of humanitarian aid by Jordan, Egypt and others? It deprives it of the ability to steal and control aid, and thus continues to work with the Zionists to save the Gazans.
What rot! What nonsense! All anti-genocide voices have condemned the airdrops. They're a case of too little, too late. They're cruel and cynical and far too dangerous.
أرجوكم توقفوا عن مساعدتنا بهذا الشكل أنتم تقتلوننا.
Here we see the airdrop land on a family tent. In this way, scores of innocent, already starving Palestinians have been murdered. Imagine the indignity of being killed by your fellow Arabs as charity this way. Including the day before yesterday, where a boy was unalived by a direct airdrop. How easy would it be to affix a small drone with camera, speaker and steering to each airdrop to ensure they land slowly and safely away from any civilian? Very easy is the answer. They don't do that because the purpose of the airdrops is not about alleviating the suffering of the Gazans. It's about muffling domestic disgust at the suffering. The airdrops are first and foremost a PR stunt.
A drop
Airdrops
in the
are
ocean.
performative.
It's nowhere near enough food for the some 2 million Palestinians on the ground, slowly starving. In Al-Zawada camp in central Gaza, those forced to fight over the precious few packages say this method of delivering aid leaves them hungry and humiliated.
We don't want to receive aid like this.
The airdrops are performative. They're carried out to placate domestic and international audiences to prove to them that they're doing something instead of nothing, instead of what they can and should be doing, which is forcing America to force Israel to let the aid-laden lorries in under UN supervision.
The food parcels fall where they fall. There's no organised distribution, with lists of recipients and priority for the vulnerable, as the UN used to ensure. No, this is food aid for the fittest, the boys and young men, those who can climb over barbed wire and run the fastest. No one else has a chance. Some bags break, so those who can't keep up gather single grains of rice from the sand. How could you feed a family on this?
The planes drop for those who are strong. Everyone else returns to their children hungry and tired. People who were well off, even doctors, now come here and get humiliated, and then return to their children with nothing.
As for those lead Western government protestations about the Palestinian suffering and their threatening Israel with recognition of a Palestinian state, all that huffing and puffing is also theatre, bluster and bluff designed to convince the public that what's happening in Palestine is other than a genocide by design, an Anglo-American Franco-German sponsored genocide. Check this out. This US Zio is saying it out loud.
I feel very strongly that they're isolated by the leadership of most Western democracies for public consumption. What's going on behind the scenes is very, very close cooperation with Israel on a whole variety of defense intelligence matters, and the alliance between the Western world and Israel remains as strong as ever. The problem is you have a lot of people in a lot of liberal places now protesting, wanting a state for the Palestinians, and unfortunately the French leader, the Italian leader, and others have to pay lip service to that. But I don't think Israel has been abandoned by 1 inch.
See, if you listen close enough, you'll hear the admission that the decimation of Gaza is of US-led Western making. They don't even bother, when pressed by the seasoned press, to blame the resistance at all, unlike the extremists who claim Islam, Salafiyya no less, who claim to be championing Sunniness.
If Trump does decide that it is time to end the war, if he does conclude, Krishnan, that he was misled, and I'm being very mellow and subdued here by calling it misled by Mr. Netanyahu, and promises and pledges have not been kept and fulfilled, then one phone call could end this war. Believe it or not, one phone call from Trump, and this war will probably end, and that would be more than any other communique from 25 or 55 other countries.
Again, the honest Israeli is putting the onus squarely on Trump, not on the resistance, you chump. Which just goes to show, just goes to speak to the treachery of the Ghulat, that they constantly attack the authority, the Muslim authority in Gaza. Speaking of treachery, so protests are praiseworthy now, all of a sudden. If it's a regime you want to see destroyed, protests have now become halal and wholesome. Everywhere else, they're haram and khariji. But before we speak to that rank hypocrisy, let's first consider what Israeli military protocols these protests actually speak to. You have the Hannibal Directive, which directs the Israelis to wipe out their own rather than allow them to be taken prisoner. And that directive has no apparent connection to the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who during the Second Punic Wars in the 3rd century BCE crossed the Alps with his war elephants. You also have the Samson option, where the Israelis threaten to launch massive nuclear strikes against their neighbors should they fear they're on the brink of military defeat. And this protocol, of course, is named after the biblical hero Samson, who summoned super strength to bring down the pillars of the Philistine temple, killing himself and everyone else inside along with him. The Samson option similarly threatens mutually assured destruction of the entire Middle East. And then you have the Dahia doctrine, named after the Dahia district of southern Beirut. During the 2006 Lebanon war, the Israelis deliberately and disproportionately pummeled the civilian population of Dahia, mass murdering them and destroying their homes and civilian infrastructure. And one of the intended consequences of that was to turn the surviving residents against their own fighters instead of against the Israelis who had visited all that death and destruction upon them. So what we're seeing here with these anti-resistance protests are the intended results of the Dahia doctrine being employed in real time against the civilians of Gaza. The people are turning against and venting against their own instead of against the IDF who destroyed their families and neighbors in their homes. So this guy's got a real nerve when he speaks of treason.
Hamas Zionist media continues to accuse Muslim rulers of treason and to incite the people against their rulers. May Allah take them and rid the country of them.
What a cheek. The gall of it all. He accuses the resistance of treason and incitement while he's doing just that. The pillock is quite literally encouraging khuruj bil lisan, sedition, for the Muslims to revolt against their leaders in Palestine. If this was done against the Gulf monarchies, it would be suggestive of Kharijism. But when it's incitement against any ruler or authority that is not politically aligned with the rulers the Ghulat favor, then amazingly they give them a pass. That's why we say all Ghulat, those who go to extremes in takfir, as well as those who go to extremes in tabdi', they all drink from the same poison chalice. They are two sides of the same counterfeit coin. Their animus for the ummah is visceral as it is plainly visible. We don't even find non-Muslims expressing such indifference and cold-heartedness towards the Palestinians as these neo-Kharijites do. And one might say, hang on. This guy and like-minded gormless kits don't speak for anyone but themselves being but a small subsect of South Asians, Indians and Pakistanis, or local influences in the Gulf whose demographic following is in any case Indian or Pakistani. Maybe it's some latent Hinduism where they subconsciously think they'll be reincarnated as Gulf Arabs, as Khalijis. Of course they won't, and nor will the Gulf Arabs ever accept them, to say nothing of granting them nationality. But even as wannabe Khalijis, these people don't behave like Khalijis. Gulf Arabs don't talk like this, not the religious ones. Secular and liberal Arab nationalists, maybe, yes, maybe. But we don't give any regard to that crowd. We don't concern ourselves with the political opinions of secular liberals when they have bigger problems, namely their irreverence for religion itself. And by the way, when we condemn nationalism, we need to distinguish here between blameworthy nationalistic sentiment and patriotism. Patriotism, love of one's homeland, even if it's expressed within the boundaries of a political entity, can be praiseworthy if you love that state, if you love your homeland, on account of what is pleasing to Allah, on account of the safety, the security provided the citizenry, and if it allows them to worship Allah and express their religion freely. The aspect of nationalism we're condemning is the ism, where a person takes the ideological foundation of a state as superior to that of the religion, or as a rival to the religion, or as being better than what the religion prescribes in terms of how a society should be governed. Anyway, the only Gulf Arabs who you'll find speak like these scarabs is the likes of this munafiq.
Deport those Islamists. Do not let them harm your children. Do not let them harm your society, your community.
Your man here will speak with the smear of the Yahud against the Muslims because he's already left the fold of Islam, or at the very least, he's fraternizing with Kufr on account of his Zionism. And the barking of the Ghulat is even more of a nuisance than these canines because they uniquely combine between conservative Islam and callousness against the people of Islam. That's why I say they are flag worshippers. Worshippers of the flags of the GCC specifically. Not worship in the sense that they take those flags as gods, but because whatever political stances those states may take, these idiots take as deen. And Allah said of the Jews and Christians, they took their rabbis and their monks as lords besides Allah, as they did with the Messiah, the son of Mary too, while they were commanded to worship none but one God, Allah. There is no deity but He. Glorified be He above those they associate with Him. And Adi bin Hatim said, when he heard the Prophet recite this verse, O Messenger of Allah, they did not worship them. He wasn't rejecting, astaghfirullah, the ayah. He was simply failing to understand it from his own experience. And so he inquired. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, indeed, they used to make lawful for them, the clergy of the Jews and Christians used to make lawful for their laity what Allah had forbidden. And they forbade for them what Allah had made lawful. And they, the people, followed them in this. فَتِلْكَ عِبَادَتُهُمْ إِيَّاهُمْ. This then was their worship of them. Okay, so now questions, any comments, corrections, complaints, even any super chats if we're fortunate. We do need your support. I appreciate it's in the middle of the week. Not the best time, but you've got to start sometime, especially when we've been away for so long. We'll reconvene in the weekend anyway, perhaps with a guest. So let's go through these comments. Long time. Yep, and welcome salam to everyone. Someone is saying, let's not forget the drugs that they planted into the aid. Yeah, I saw a report about that. Drugs and spoiled aid and all kinds of nastiness. And that's even with regards to the aid that gets through the trucks, because some of those trucks, as I'm sure many of you are aware, get attacked by settlers, and the food gets and the goods get spilt out even before the trucks, even those which actually make it in, even they don't seem to be given to the rightful owners without being attacked and ruined. Of course, we've had, besides the issue directly related to Palestine, indirectly related to Palestine, of course, one of the biggest news items was an Orthodox nun who appeared and gave an interview on Tucker Carlson, speaking what most Muslims already know, which is that Muslims, Christians, and Jews who are not extreme violent genocidal type, they tend to get on, and they tend to live as neighbors and eat together and even intermarry, according to what is allowed in Islam. And this comes as a surprise to those who've been raised upon a diet of Islamophobic propaganda, believing that all Muslims, whenever they're in contact or in the vicinity of non-Muslims, then they will hope to hurt them. The non-Muslims will live in fear of them. And this is not the case. Generally, in the Middle East, in most of the countries, Muslims, Christians, and again, those Jews who are not, likewise, those Christians who are not violently Zionist, will get on just like Muslims will get on with any ordinary neighbor. They generally don't distinguish. You generally don't distinguish your neighbor on terms of their religion. If they're not Muslim, you don't tend to throw your rubbish into their drive or into their garden, or insult them or spit towards them just because they don't happen to be of the same religion as you. Why do we think this would happen in Muslim majority countries? Well, clearly people do seem to think this, so it's come as a bit of surprise to hear that Muslims and Christians who are suffering at the same discrimination and persecution at the hands of the Zionists tend to get on and tend to feel there's a common cause and a common foe in their plight and in their hope to live together in a free Palestine and by extension a free Levant. Maybe we will cover some of those talking points again on the weekend with a guest. What else has been going on? Of course, there's a court case that came to light of a particular influencer who took the Spectator to court and Douglas Murray for defamation. And there's been some fallout regarding that. I've commented on it quite a bit on X. And we saw, or as was reported, Speaker's Corner type antics fail miserably in court. And as a result, a huge figure of £670,000 has been ordered to be paid in terms of legal fees, expenses, and fines. Yeah, that's a tough one. That's tough for anyone to have to face those kind of financial penalties. You'd expect in such a circumstances, one would be obliged to declare bankruptcy. But there is a difference between how courts, particularly where there's no juries, operate, and between how dawah and arguments are made in a speaker's corner type setting. In a speaker's corner type setting, whoever can shout the loudest, rally the mob the most, bamboozle, chest puff, outshout, out-sophist their opponent, they will win the crowd, they will win the mob, and they will be seen to be winning the arguments. But in a court, particularly where there's no jury, as was told to me by a high court barrister, be in no doubt the smartest man in the room is the judge. We're talking the creme de la creme of the legal profession, high court especially, the English high court, extremely smart people. I'm not saying that they're upon the haqq or truth or always just, despite them being in the justice industry. But the point is that it's very foolish to think one can pull the wool over the eyes of that level of expertise, that level of awareness of lies. You can't pull those kind of tactics, grandstanding, gallivanting, shouting, using sophistry, faking documents, and so on and so forth, bearing false witness. None of that will work. That will all work against you in a high court setting. All they want to see in high court is, does your claim stand up to the evidence? And it's up to you then to argue that the evidence is other than what it plainly seems to say, that your speech was other than what you claimed it was. And in such a circumstance, if your facts aren't supported by your speech, or if the facts are contradictory, I should say, by your speech, the facts that you yourself published, then you will fail miserably. And that seems to have been what happened at that court. We have a question or a comment. The clip showing the pundit saying that a Palestinian state is simply lip service, what I was suspecting all along. Yeah, it's they said the quiet part out loud. They don't really care for a state, for justice. They want this job to be finished. It reminds us, by the job I mean the genocide, it reminds us of the Bosnian genocide, where there was a complaint made in the corridors of power in the European Union, amongst some of the European states, that they wanted the Serbs to get on with it. They were taking too long genociding the Bosnians. The Bosnians were fighting back despite their arms embargo against them and all the odds against them. And they wanted the Serbs to just get on with it and hurry up. It was becoming a bit of an embarrassment. And then you had some outliers, people like Margaret Thatcher of the UK, believe it or not, who came out against the West's complicity in the Bosnian genocide. And then even Bill Clinton expressed in his memoirs his shock at, was it Mitterrand or Chirac, one of the two, whoever was the French president at the time, saying that we cannot tolerate a Muslim state in the heart of Europe. And Clinton, a dishonest person that he is, was still surprised at the gall of the French leader in essentially saying that if a genocide is what it's going to take to get rid of a Muslim state within Europe, then darn it, that's what we, the Europeans, are going to have to enable somehow and acquiesce. And the way they did that was through the arms embargo, but Allah had other plans. What do you think of the claim that Israel propped up the group for the October 7th flood in order to get the green light to take over Gaza? There seems to be some evidence, some claims by Israelis even to that regard, how much they enabled it. Perhaps it seems to be the case. What is absolutely clear is that the goal has always been genocide, ethnically cleanse the entire Palestine's entirety. And if you can utilize a pretext or get a casus belli in order to justify an attack and invasion, then maybe they would do that. Not too dissimilar from what happens in major world wars like World War II, the Sudeten pogroms against the German speakers was a pretext that Hitler used then to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, because the goal was always to take the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia as it was then. Likewise, the goal in this case is always to take Palestine, ethnically cleanse them, and religiously, so this is part of their religion, the religious right, who are in power. They have no desire at all to accommodate any Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but of course we see also in the West Bank. The comment, yeah, the UN conveniently stepped in just as the Bosnians found their foothold and started to take back territory. That's when the West stepped in. Exactly. Exactly right. Unfortunately, the Bosnians started to fight back. They started to gain ground. They were approaching Banja Luka, if I'm not mistaken, which was a stronghold of the Serbs in the western part of Bosnia. Had they taken Banja Luka, they would have cut off the western quadrant of Republika Srpska, or what was about to become Republika Srpska, and all they would have been left with would have been the eastern portion around what's the capital? I forgot the capital of the Serbian Republic, Republika Srpska, within Bosnia. And of course, that's when the Americans particularly stepped in. That's when the Dayton Accords and what was his name, Richard Holbrooke, got involved and told the Bosnians to sort it out, calm down. You know, we can't have you taking all of this territory. And so they imposed a peace plan upon them. Alija Izetbegovic complained at the time and said we had no choice. He said he was threatened. He was threatened by the Americans that if you don't stop, instead of bombing the Serbs, we'll end up bombing you. So he said, what could we do? So he had to capitulate, and he had to settle for 51% of what should have been 100% of the republic or the country of Bosnia, which even then is truncated. Parts of it were carved off and given to Serbia and Croatia, Montenegro, etc. I mean, historic Bosnia. And that's why it's a landlocked country. It should have a seaport, which they use. What's the seaport they use? I forgot now. They rent it for 100 years. Is it for 100 years or for 100 million euros? I've got one of them hundreds. This is a port in Croatia to give them access to the sea, the Adriatic. But they had a stretch historically. They had their own coastal stretch anyway. So landlocking a country is one way to block it off from international support, and it will then make it easier to genocide the people. Just like in Gaza, even though they have the sea, they're not able to go to the coast without suffering, getting bombed and picked apart. Even when they go, like these airdrops, when they go to fish the airdrops, they get shot at, or when they go to fish, they get shot at. So even though they have a coast, they're not able to benefit from it. And then they turn the Bosnian on. Then they forced on Bosnia the Dayton Agreement still hinders the country from advancing functionally properly. Yeah, exactly. Not to mention how the UN had a big turned Bosnia into a brothel somewhat. You know, they already had victims there, women victims of that word I don't use, you know, gang rape. And even on top of that, then the UN, which is quite nasty, were caught in many scandals where they were turning the locals into prostitutes or bringing in prostitutes after all they'd suffered. What else we got? I think that's it. So where I'm asked, can you speak more about the Bosnian genocide? What can we draw from their example? For one is resilience. They fought back. The Bosnians, incidentally, were the flower of the Ottoman Empire, the Bosnians as a nation were the largest physically. Even today, if you look at any statistics, they will tell you the largest of all European people, I mean physically large in terms of stature, are the Dutch. But that's only because the genetic tribe in which the Bosnians intermixed or form a part of their ethnogenesis comes from, the Dinaric race along the Dinaric coast. They are split between Montenegro and Bosnia and Croatia. Otherwise, had they all been within historic Bosnia, you would find that the Bosnians are the largest, physically largest of all European peoples. And this is not just that they're physically large and they don't do anything with it, they were also very good at fighting. And in the Battle of Kosovo-Poje, in the year, I've forgotten now, so I'm not going to make a mistake. Anyway, the Battle of Kosovo-Poje, famous Battle of Kosovo-Poje, where you had the Kosovo Plain, where you had a Christian alliance against the Ottomans, and the Bosnians commanded the right wing in that battle, and the Duke of Bosnia, his name escapes me, subhanallah, and anyway, maybe it's that time of night. Anyway, the Bosnian right wing, Christian wing, won in terms of their engagement against the Ottomans. They were successful. They were so successful that they decided to leave the field. They thought, okay, that's it. We've defeated the Ottomans. Let's go home. Because it was a united coalition of all the Christians of that part of the world, of the Balkans, under the Hungarians and the Serbs, the Albanians themselves, and the Bosnians and others. I think there were some Germans and others present. And the Bosnians turned around and said, okay, we won. We've defeated them. They went home, not realizing that the rest of the coalition was still struggling. And the Ottomans made a note. They won the Battle, of course, the Ottomans, and they made a note of this, of the military, the martial prowess of the Bosnians. And from that point onwards, they started investing in Bosnia. And there were certain, what's the word I'm looking for? Certain things, elements, which facilitated the mass conversion in a relatively short period of time of the Bosnians to Islam. One being the uniqueness of their church, another being that their church not just being unique, but didn't have any sister church neighboring it. So, for example, the Croatians are Catholics, and they share that church with the rest of Catholicism and the other Catholic states. The Vatican being the capital, of course, of Catholicism. The Serbs are Orthodox Christian, and they share their Orthodox Christianity with other Orthodox Christian nations, the Greeks and Armenians and the Russians and so on. But the Bosnians, not only did they have a unique church, which had some things which made it look, which endeared them towards Islam because of some of their practices. But on top of that, there was no other church that shared their creed outside of Bosnia. So when you're cut off like that, this is where the top down of a Muslim state, of a Muslim rule, helps spread Islam, as well as the grassroots dawah. So the two work in hand. The state encouraging missionary activity, and then the people themselves feeling inclined towards the religion because of its civilizational pull, and because it's of course it's the veracity of its message. So when the Bosnians the Ottoman Empire retreated, there was some genocides after World War I, and then the Bosnians were left in Yugoslavia, which was a communist country, light communism with a small c, not quite at the level of Russia and China, or at least what Russia and China were at the same time, under Tito particularly. It was a secular state, but the Muslims were allowed to practice their religion should they choose to, and there wasn't that much practice. Islam was very weak in all the Eastern Bloc countries. And so then when the genocide happened, as well as the tragedy, it was also an awakening for the Bosnians to rediscover their religion. And some of them famously had this sentiment, or many of them had this sentiment, that were it not for the violence inflicted upon them, they may not have returned back to their religion. And so they're grateful for the trial that Allah put them through, that as much as they suffered in this world, at least they reconnected with Allah, and those who died upon Islam died as martyrs, and those who survived and returned to the practice of their religion. And one thing it taught us that you can't trust anyone. You are left to your own devices. Some countries tried to help. Pakistan helped, Saudi Arabia helped, and other Muslim countries tried to help because of the Turkey helped a bit. None of them helped as much as, or some of them should have helped a lot more considering their proximity to the country. It was a bit strange that countries as far as Saudi Arabia and Pakistan would help, but that's purely because of religious affinity, because the people were moved as Muslims. These are our Muslim brothers and sisters. We have to come to their aid. Others who are not only their fellow Muslims, but in the ballpark, they could have did a lot more, but they chose not to because they themselves were more secular and didn't promote that kind of pan-Islamic or ummatic sentiment or give it voice. Whereas, of course, a country like Pakistan, which claims to be an Islamic Republic, or Saudi Arabia, which is home to the Haramain, it cannot but help carry and represent Islamic sentiment, at least amongst the people. And so that's why there was some support. But really, militarily, they were on their own. And despite the best efforts of their enemies and the enabling of their frenemies, who were no friends of the Sirs, but still they weren't friends of the Muslims either, they still survived, alhamdulillah. Okay, some other questions. Let's maybe going too fast through these. What we got here? NATO used the Bosnians to fight the Serbian Serbs just like they use in Ukraine now. We'll get into Ukraine another session because that's obviously a big deal. And the Ukrainian population has been decimated, thinned out, as is the Russians, but the Ukrainians take it a lot less, which is a bit of a travesty, and because it won't be to the benefit of either Ukrainians or the Russians or the Muslims, should the rest of that male population continue to be thinned out. It will be to the benefit of those who are also committing the genocide in Palestine. Unlike the surrounding nations, Bosnian genetics have also traced the Illyrians, apparently, which is interesting. Yeah, the Illyrians themselves, of all of the Balkan peoples, the Albanians have the greatest claim on the ancient Illyrians. Illyria is mentioned in, I think, Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare play, but it was an actual tribe. The Bosnians are Slavic and mixed with Dinaric. They would have mixed with Illyrians simply because Illyria is occupied what is now, or what became Yugoslavia. But of all the peoples in the Balkans, the unrelated Albanians and Kosovars, of course, and the Albanians of Macedonia are more closely descendant from the Illyrians, but the Bosnians, of course, having settled in the same region, would have taken some of their genes, but not as much, it seems, as they did the Dinaric gene, which is, as I said, far more robust and perhaps the most robust of all European genetic pools outside of the North Caucasus. As we hear, they're just built different. People in the North Caucasus are built different, and then amongst the Balkans, the Bosnians are built different, but then they've had this, I forgot to mention, they've had this fighting spirit, this martial prowess stripped away over the years after the collapse or the withdrawal of the Ottoman Empire, that the Bosnians were always at the forefront amongst the Janissary, the Janissary cause. But after the retreat of the Bosnians, the Ottomans, the Bosnians were no longer the vanguard in any Islamic army, apart from the odd appearance they made under the Habsburgs, under the Austrians particularly. They were patronized, even under the Nazis. There was some, the Sanjak division, etc. But they really lost that fighting culture, that martial culture disappeared in Bosnia. And had it been there, perhaps they would have fared a lot better against the genocide, but they survived all the same, alhamdulillah. Okay, controversial question. Knowledge North, do you believe Sheikh Faisal al-Jassim is a Sururi? It's upon the people to evidence that he has takes which are, how should we say this? Controversial, obviously, but let's say they are pushing the boundaries, right? But he's not calling for sedition. He's speaking in a political realm. He's speaking on politics. And for some people, including what I covered in the first half an hour here, that itself is sururism, is misguided, that you enter into politics. And that's because they're projecting their own reality. In the reality, if you're in the certain Muslim countries, most Muslim countries, speaking about politics is a taboo, and that's not abnormal. You would have that since the time of Bani Umayyah. You could not take a political stance publicly against the authority because it would be seen as seditious and encouraging fitna and type of thing, and that's normal. We're not, and if you're in that environment, then fine. But you can't impose that upon those outside that environment or upon the people of knowledge who, without going misguided, do have takes on politics. And so when someone has an independent take, does their research, and takes a divergent view from, let's say, many of the other people of knowledge within his region, whether it's issue on Palestine or whatever it might be, then one of the ways to silence that person or to demonize that person is to throw around accusations of sururism or ikhwanism. But you have to see, has the person's pronouncements contradicted the Quran and Sunnah or not? Do they have a precedent amongst other scholars who are alive or recently deceased? And if they do, and in the case of Palestine, many of them, his pronouncements do, his positions do, then that is not a sign of sururism or ikhwanism. In order for you to accuse someone of being any kind of adjective, tasmiyah, such as sururi, ikhwani, or qutbi, or any kind of these things, you have to show where they have followed the innovation that is associated with that group, with that sect, or with that movement. And if the person brings book and the sunnah and does not promote the innovation of that particular group or sect or movement, then this appellation, this labeling, may be a bit overboard. Okay, what should our stance be with the Russian-Ukraine war? All wars bad, and this war is a war of Western making, particularly of Joseph Biden, Sleepy Joe. It hasn't did good for either country. As I've mentioned elsewhere, I know personally brothers on both sides who fighting and suffered, whether they were conscripts or volunteers. So all wars are bad, especially where generally, right? Of course, I'm not talking about jihad. Of course, that's a noble thing, or just war. But there's no justice in this. It seems to be one way of the US trying to establish its hegemony and to cripple its Cold War rival. That seems to be the base of it. And the Ukrainians are getting caught up in the middle. Of course, the Russians are as well. But the Ukrainians are more pawns in this regard. And they're a brotherly nation, a fraternal nation. It's said in jest the difference between the Ukrainians are basically Russians with the Polish accent. This is what Putin, I believe, said, which is obviously very offensive to Ukrainians. But the fact of the matter is the difference, the way the language is separated and the ethnos diverged, is that the Russians were the Eastern Slavs under the Tatars, Muslims, Mongol Tatars, and the Ukrainians were under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So they were one nation, but they diverged depending on who was ruling them, and then that caused some separation and disjuncture in terms of their language, and then eventually that language was legalized on the borders, the border of Ukraine versus Russia, etc., and this causes fraternal people to break up. Of course, the first Russia, Kievan Russia, the capital of Kiev, the capital of that Kievan Rus, is the capital of Ukraine, not the capital of Rus or Russia. And it was built by Khazars. The Khazars, we've spoken about them previously, they built the city of Kiev, interestingly. Anyway, that's a longer discussion. Maybe we'll talk about that in a separate show. Let's keep going through the questions. Iran helped us. I was going to say Iran did help. Yes, Iran did help well, which is why sadly you'll find a portion of Bosnians defending them loudly, especially if they're not on strong foundation. Yeah, that's true. Iran did, for its own reasons, get involved in the Bosnian war. I almost mentioned them, but I thought I'd just give them a pass. But okay, you mentioned it, and we're not afraid to speak the truth. And the fact of the matter is one of those countries that really tried to get involved in Bosnia. But thankfully the country stayed Sunni. Sharif. The will of Anas Sharif, rahmatullah alayhi, that was shared is simply heartbreaking to read. May Allah enter him into the highest level of Jannah. Ameen. That into highest level of Jannah. Ameen. That is the journalist who was killed along with some of his other journalists from Al Jazeera a few days ago, a couple of days ago, whenever that was. I haven't read his will, so maybe we will share that later. Okay, are there any scholars who consider Hamas as the leaders, rulers in Gaza? The default is it's got nothing to do with the scholars. This is a point. The scholars don't decide. They don't have the power, especially of one country, to rule on the politics of another country. They give fatwa, but that's not how rulership works. In Islam, whoever has the power, this is a statement, well-known statement of Ibn Taymiyyah. Let's see if I can remember the Arabic. As-Sultan. He said the Sultan is the one who possesses the power. Suan kana, I forgot. Anyway, he said he's the one who possesses the power, whether he's righteous or a tyrant. Regardless of how he comes to power, the fact that you have power, that makes you the ruler. So whatever semblance of power Hamas have in Gaza, then they are the rulers there, though they're the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. And in the West Bank, it's a different setup, it's a Palestinian Authority. I discussed this, not these groups, but I discussed this issue of who has power in the Hizb ut-Tahrir series. But essentially, it's either through Shura, which is according to the Sunnah, or you usurp power through conquest. Either or, which could be a military coup in modern terms. Either or, once you have the power, once you have the levers of control, in whichever semblance it takes, then you are the ruler, and it's got nothing to do with the scholar in another country, whether he wants to say you're legitimate or not. The only understanding of legitimacy is to control, is to have some kind of control. And of course, the Israelis are doing their best, have been doing their best to destroy that control. That's one of the reasons why the famine has reached the level it was, is because when Hamas would take in the lorries and distribute them, they would be deliberately targeted. They'd be, the police and the security apparatus would be targeted by the Israelis, and so then there was no security left over the food, and then the looters and the smugglers came in instead. Then it was a free-for-all, and so on and so forth. And that's part of course, what the job of a ruler is, or the people in power, is that they maintain a level of law and order. But if you destroy their police force, deliberately, of course, to create anarchy, then that's what will result. And it will look like you have a lawless country. It will look like you have a failed state. Of course, in a war, that's certainly what it looks like right now. But we should say there are scholars who mention them. Mention that amongst them Ahl Sunnah, Sheikh Mashur Hassan, and the scholars of the region, Jordan, who are Palestinian scholars anyway, students of Albani, they know best the situation there. Other scholars such as Sheikh Abdul Karim Al-Khudair spoke about them, that they are not to be opposed, and other scholars as well from around the Muslim world. And of course, they have their own scholars, Ahl Sunnah, within Palestine. I've bumped into a few in some visits, my own travels there back in the day. Okay, related question. I know the statement, that's why I'm asking, because there are some du'at who criticize Hamas and said the PA in the West Bank are the true rulers. It's considering criticizing the rulers. Yeah, these are really silly things. Okay, first of all, there's nothing wrong with criticizing a movement, right? You shouldn't cause sedition, but if a movement has certain religious misguidances, or it's linked to misguidance, be it Ikhwani or otherwise, there's nothing wrong with calling out those aspects of misguidance. But as for inciting revolt and sedition and hatred, then of course this is against Sunnah, and it leads to fitna and fawda, and it's not from our methodology. Neither do we sanctify and sanitize the rulers of Muslims, but nor do we scandalize them. The Salaf would be loath to speak about their rulers. You give them their rights, where those rights don't contravene the rights of Allah, but that's about it. But this thing about they're not the true rulers because the PA in the West Bank are the true rulers, I mean, this is really stupid. Do we follow democracy now? Because well, even if you did, actually, they won the Hamas won the democratic vote, and then there was a coup, and then they countered the counter coup, and that's why they managed to maintain Gaza, but they lost West Bank. And as all experts say, this is incontroversial, that had there been a vote within the West Bank, Hamas would have won by landslide, because they are not seen as the police for the occupation, whereas the PA are seen as a police force for the occupation. So how is it in terms of Islam? In terms of Islam, how can one say the PA are the true rulers and the people in Gaza aren't? When we, from our methodology, if you, through ghalaba, through conquest, you become a legitimate ruler through conquest. Or are you saying it has to be only those recognized by the Western allies, on their allies, by the democratic coalition of pro-Israeli states? Only if they recognize you're legitimate. This is stupid. This has got nothing to do with religion. Whoever says this, it's like they're abandoning their Islam when it comes to Palestine, but then everywhere else, no, it's okay. We can have rulers, we can have monarchs and presidents and kings and generals, but except in Palestine, it has to be those who the West support. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's people, and that's why, subhanAllah, why I wanted to say what I said at the top first half hour or so, is because, look, if you choose not to speak about politics, fine, but then you can't. But then these people are not doing that. They're not staying silent. They're not imposing a gagging order on themselves when they take warped political views and when they condemn those who may not agree with them. If you have a difference of opinion, fine. But then to condemn and demonize and make tabdi' of those who have a different view to you, and they can justify that with the book and the sunnah, then you are an extremist and you are flag worshipping. You're imposing your particular understanding upon others. Whereas if anything, you should be quiet. You should shut up, because you yourself are not following your own, you're not practicing what your preachers don't talk about politics, but then they talk about politics and making these ridiculous statements as the one, or as this sentiment that we've just expressed or read. Otherwise, if there's no more questions, thank you everyone for your time, and we shall reconvene on the weekend. So thank you very much. Jazakumullahu khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.